Greetings and welcome back to Room 303 AP English, our Roberts Lectures. We are in the poetry section. We turn now to the great Mark Strand and his poetry offering, Eating Poetry, from 1968. Now, Strand, 19 dates, 1934 to 2014. He is Canadian-born American poet, essayist, and of course Strand did a lot of translation work as well. He was Poet Laureate Consultant in Poetry to the Library of Congress in 1990, and he did receive the Wallace Stevens Award in 2004. Of course, Stevens, one of the great poets of 303 for us. One of the things I love about this poem is that it's one of those, I'm sorry, what? Poems. And of course you're smiling because we know these poems in 303. I'm sorry, what? Wait, what did we just read? That's what this poem, Eating Poetry, will be all about. Very similar to, for example, when we do Marquez's Very Old Man with Enormous Wings, or, Uncle Marcos. These texts that we call magical realism, we're going to get some of that idea here as well. Finally, before we read this poem, I'd like you to think about the power of language, and especially art, and especially poetry. Eating poetry. Ink runs from the corners of my mouth. There is no happiness like mine. I've been eating poetry. The librarian does not believe what she sees. Her eyes are sad, and she walks with her hands in her dress. The poems are gone. The light is dim. The dogs are on the basement stairs and coming up. Their eyeballs roll, their blonde legs burn like brush. The poor librarian begins to stamp her feet and weep. She does not understand. When I get on my knees and lick her hand, she screams. I am a new man. I snarl at her and bark. I romp with joy in the bookish dark. Now, right away, let's just pay attention to the form at level 2B. Notice the poem is nicely divided into these stanzas of 3 lines. Notice the economy of language. Nothing is wasted in a Mark Strand offering, and we've said this before in other poems of his that we've studied. No waste of energy at all. Notice the genius of the opening line. Ink runs from the corners of my mouth. That is to say, I'm reading powerful stuff is like eating something you love to eat so fast and so much of it that it's coming out of your mouth. Obviously, the word picture of turning, somehow metamorphosing into a dog that loves what it does, is, of course, going to be represented in that second line, no happiness like mine. That is to say, to read well is to make one's life almost like a happy puppy of a kind, right? I've been eating poetry, right? That is to say, I've been reading. Of course, immediately at 3A, we think about Keats's and Chapman's Homer. Upon first looking into Chapman's Homer, much have I traveled in the realms of gold. Then felt I like some watcher of the skies when a new planet swims into his ken. That notion that good reading is like traveling for Keats here. Good reading is like eating something that... Have you ever watched a dog eat a bone, chew on a bone? He just loves it. Same thing. Notice then we have the juxtaposition of the other. That is to say, the formal. That is to say, the expected rendering of art. And, of course, not just the connoisseur of that art, but the gatekeeper of that art, the librarian. Now, of course, let's be fair. This is unfair to librarians who always look at this poem and say, wait, this is not fair. I mean, librarians shouldn't be perceived as these people who are the other, those gatekeepers. But here in this poem, the librarian does not believe what she sees. Now, why that's the case, we're not totally clear. Maybe that is to say she can't imagine that anybody loves poetry as much as the speaker does. Her eyes are sad. It's a powerful middle line for the second stanza. She walks with her hands in her dress. Defiance maybe is being represented. And then all of a sudden, the poem kind of shifts to some action. The poems are gone. The light is dim. The dogs are on the basement stairs and coming up. This anaphora, as we call it, right? This repetition reminds us, of course, of poetry like that of Whitman or Dickinson. And then the dogs that are coming up. their eyeballs roll. This is to say, he's not alone. In other words, there are others who have enjoyed poetry, who have enjoyed art. I'm not alone in this project, and all of a sudden they all start coming up towards the librarian. Their eyes are rolling. It's like they're on fire. Their blonde legs burn like brush. And then he says it, the poor librarian. Notice the genius of this adjective. The poor librarian begins to stamp her feet and weep. Notice you've got legs that are blonde legs on fire, and then you've got her stamping her feet. In other words, she isn't pleased because there's a use of the art, a use of the poetry, a manipulation by the speaker and other, can we say it, dogs, right? That she can't appreciate because she can't control it. But the final part of the poem is even more bizarre, taking us again to these ideas of magical realism. She doesn't understand is a key line. When I get on my knees and lick her hand, of course, understand and hand are going to rhyme here. She screams. Notice the movement from being mad, hands in pockets, to being a little bit upset, stamping feet, to finally just screaming because she doesn't understand, and this whole thing of licking the hand. Of course, note the continuation of this conceit or word picture, right? The ink is running out of the mouth, so if you're licking her hand, you're drooling ink onto her hand. But then the final three-line stanza, I am a new man. This is a poem about transformation. This is the phoenix motif. This is this coming alive again because one has all of a sudden exchanged powerful art, poetry. I snarl at her and bark. In other words, it's tension now. It's combative. It's, you can't keep the poetry away from me. You can't tell me the ways I'm supposed to interpret this stuff. And then finally we're back to the opening image of happiness. I romp with joy in the bookish dark. Now this notion of the dark, in other words, you get the sense that it's like the great insights that librarians should be possessing are somehow going away because of their inability to read and reread and appreciate the poetry and the art. I like to think of 3a about the ways that St. Augustine spoke in his Confessions about as a child, as a young boy, reading, he said, about the whole relationship between Aeneas and Dido, and he wept for Dido. Now, of course, he points out in Confessions he should have been weeping for himself, but there's such a powerful resonance about that for us in our study of St. Augustine, as we've spoken about it at learnstrong.net. Well, what is the primary message here at 2a? Well, obviously, poetry or art, it does have the power to transform if one knows how to eat well, right? And of course, many here, unfortunately, it's librarians, those in control, we might say, they often don't understand. Remember what we've said before in 303. We are the stories we tell and retell. We're also the stories we accept, and we're also the stories we reject. And as we've often said, this is why the canon's so important for us. This is why librarians, if we can use that metaphor, are so important for us. You got to know the texts before you can decide. You got to know the stories before you can decide whether you're going to accept or reject them. And you may reject some part and not all. You can't really enjoy a meal until you've eaten it. Looking at it's not going to be enough, in other words. At 2b, since we're there, obviously the symbolism is powerful. And we mentioned magical realism. I mean, you can read this poem on so many different levels, right? And we mentioned the repetition. That's a great one as well. How about at 3a, the way we're going to relate to this? Well, I know some of you are, first of all, going to see this as a stretch. Like, for example, watch this. Remember, our defining of learning is connecting new to old. Watch this. What does this poem have to say about the Odyssey? Well, it is true that in the Odyssey there's lots and lots of storytelling. That is true. And it is true that there's emotional and powerful responses to the storytelling. Remember, Odysseus weeps when he hears the story of the fall of Troy. Of course, nobody knows at the island of the Phaeacians who he is yet. But I want to talk about Argos, because I think that really Strand has in his mind that classic story of Argos, when Odysseus is in disguise, walking up to his castle, and there's Argos, his dog, his old dog, who, of course, is so happy to see Odysseus, and then Odysseus has to tell him to lay down, and he lays down on the poop pile and he dies. We've given full lectures on this elsewhere. How about this reference in Plato's Republic to the idea that when young people learn dialectic, they're like puppies biting on each other's ears? I like that as a reference. But I really want to go now to Ovid and to Kafka. And let's talk about metamorphosis for a second. That notion that great art transforms us in some way. It moves us, right? It moves us. It takes us from where we are to allow us to, as we have said in 303, transcend and include, to move on, and great art does that. And the librarian may not understand, ultimately she may just scream, right? As maybe the dog of a new man in the story speaker is wanting to say thank you to the librarian for giving me the opportunity to eat some of your poetry, yay. Finally, now I can ask this, see how cool this poem is? What was a time in your life when you ate poetry and you were transformed? Whoa, what a great question. Another one. Who have been the librarians in your life who have told you how you should read and eat texts or art? Oh no, that's not the right way. You're not supposed to think of it that way. Says who, right? Says who. If Prometheus teaches us anything, he teaches us the beauty of defiance, as does, of course, the great Mark Strand. I hope you'll be inclined to want to read more of his amazing stuff. Thank you.